Well, 5 months ago I posted a video calling out some of the questionable decisions made when the Neo Geo Mini was leaked. I figured it was only fair to revisit that now that the actual product is in hand to determine whether or not the Mini is the bullshit I thought it might be. The one thing we didn't quite have confirmed at the time of the leak, because like I cautioned in the video, we didn't have all of the information, was that there would be two different offerings, a Japanese and an international version. My complaint in May was that while the leaked design was a cool representation of the Japanese Neo Candy, that wasn't necessarily what I here in the States thought of when hearing the Neo Geo name. So here we are, this is what we ended up with. Not only is it not a big red, but they swapped the colors so it doesn't match the original Japanese candies either. So we got a Japanese casing with a color scheme that no one remembers because, well, it never existed. I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, but consider if Nintendo had done the same thing with the NES Classic. Instead of giving us the gray front-loading design we all loved as kids, they shipped the Classic in a Famicom case to us here in North America. Oh, and they changed the color from its original red to blue. I wonder how well that would have gone over. Now, casing and color schemes are all subjective opinions. I understand that, and I suppose the positive side of this is that the two color schemes easily differentiates the two consoles. So if you purchase both the Japanese and international unit, you could easily tell them apart without having to turn them on. That said though, I think my thoughts on this are clear, and the international model feels like a missed opportunity to deliver on that iconic big red design. My verdict on the international design: bullshit. While we're on the topic of the case, let's talk about its functionality. The screen is much nicer than I would have expected. It's bright, clear, and the colors seem rich, but not overly saturated in an artificial way. I'm also not noticing too much blurring, which would have been an absolute killer for something like this where the primary purpose is for games. Overall, this is a nice display and not something that feels overly cheap like I had expected. I'm pleasantly surprised here. The one thing that I wish was included in the case though is the presence of a chargeable battery. That would really help sell the novelty of this being a standalone portable unit, but I suppose the added cost would have pushed this higher than it already is, and it was chopped from the overall design. Finally, we have the controls. The stick, despite being small, is pretty functional and works as well as can be expected. I found the button layout to be odd, which is another thing I mentioned in my earlier video when this was rumored, but despite that, the actual buttons themselves are responsive, snappy, and haven't been sticking on me. I wouldn't want to play something like Last Resort with a small screen and controls, but as a novelty item for some casual play with a few fighters, Mutation Nation, and even the included sports titles, this isn't half bad. My verdict on the case functionality: not bullshit. While we are discussing controls, let's take a look at the gamepad. Now at first I thought they had simply swapped the color of the buttons for some odd reason, but no, they actually changed the original layout. Essentially, everything moved clockwise one place. To once again call on Nintendo, what if your new SNES controller for the Classic shipped like this? As someone who plays a lot of Neo Geo with the original gamepad, this is pretty frustrating. I had my thumb regularly hitting the wrong buttons on several games I was pretty familiar with, so my muscle memory was definitely a little off. That said, I was of course able to adjust to a specific action being performed by a button that was now in a different location on the controller. Like firing your weapon on Metal Slug, for instance. This is a repeatable action that you just kind of go with after a few seconds. What I did find more difficult was a game like Football Frenzy, where you are choosing a receiver based on their assigned button letter. It's harder since you actually have to think about where B is now assigned on the gamepad, because multiple buttons pass the ball and you have to pick the right one that's displayed on the screen. This was a little trickier. The one pro of this configuration, as pointed out by Mad Little Pixel on Twitter, was that this change makes sense for King of Fighters players, as the new button layout is more accommodating to the control scheme. Now in theory, I don't doubt that that is spot on correct. I do, however, wonder for anyone who has played the King of Fighters series routinely with OG hardware, how hard is it to readjust? My assumption there is that muscle memory is going to botch this for you if and when you do decide to play a few games on the Mini, and I think that that goes back to my earlier comment about me having a difficult time with this on some of the non-fighters. SNK assumed a lot of people interested in this device wouldn't have a reference point, and that the other market segment, the SNK fans, would simply just get over it and adjust. I think this change has potential to be positive for a handful of games in a best case scenario, and at worst, it's going to annoy the hell out of the rest of us. The other notable change with the controller is the lack of micro switches on the stick. This is one of my favorite features on the original gamepad and allows for an interesting arcade stick click, but shrunk down into a gamepad. Its absence on the Neo Mini controllers is glaring and disappointing. The new stick seems to stretch too far from its base when compared to the original. I think if the radius could have been shrunk a little, the absence of the micro switches might not have been as noticeable. Right now, it just feels too wide, and that throws off the experience. Once again though, if you haven't played with the original controller, then you wouldn't know what you're missing out on. This is an easy one to grade from a Neo fan's perspective. The new controller is bullshit. However, if you're a casual player looking to experience Neo for the first time, this could slide by as passable. Barely. Alright, the games. On the last video I mentioned there were some suspect decisions about what was offered on the list that leaked, and one of those was that more than 25% of the list was comprised of Metal Slug and King of Fighter games. Well, now that we know we have 2 Neo Mini versions, does that change anything? Well, actually 11 of those games are still Metal Slug or King of Fighter games, but we are treated to all 6 of the Metal Slug titles and just 5 of the King of Fighter titles. That's a high percentage of your mini library tied up with just 2 franchises, but overall, I can live with that. There's a decent representation of genres here overall, including Mutation Nation and Robo Army. Thankfully they skipped Burning Fight for the beat-em-ups. We have shooters like Blazing Star, Ghost Pilots, and the tough checkpoint shooter Last Resort, Puzzle, Blues Journey, 3 Count Bout, the King of Monsters games, Magician Lord, lots of good stuff here. There are, however, some titles I was surprised to find absent. Neo Turf Masters, the first Samurai Showdown, Nam 1975, which was another launch title, and no Baseball Stars 2. Now everyone is going to have their own thoughts on this list, but those are just a few of the titles I would have found a way to squeeze in. Overall though, I think they did a nice job mixing up the list genre-wise. My verdict on the games list, not bullshit. I wanted to talk about the overall emulation of these games since I have a fair amount of experience playing on original hardware. But upon connecting to the TV for the first time, I was quickly derailed by something else, the video output. It's noticeably much more poor than what I'm used to seeing from my Pi or the few titles that I have on my Nintendo Switch. I went into the options to see if the system had somehow defaulted to a 480p output rather than 720p, and no, that's not the case. Regardless of the settings, the image just looks like it has some type of filter applied to it. The one option that I could find that might correlate to this in the settings just smooths edges even more so, which takes me in the opposite direction I wanted to go. To give you a fair comparison, I turned off all filters on my RetroPie and set the output to 720p. Metal Slug 3 looks substantially sharper coming off the Pi than it does on the SNK Mini. I even set my Nintendo Switch to 720p for a fair comparison and grabbed some video from Metal Slug 3, and that too is substantially better quality than what the Neo Mini is producing. I just don't get it. This isn't an acceptable output for something that costs $100. I hate to go back to Nintendo yet again, but this wasn't a problem with either of the classics they put out, so I'm not sure why it has to be with the Neo Mini. I'm really surprised that this is the quality of the output. It's like we're just waiting for a veil to be lifted on the image. I really honestly don't know if it's a limitation of the hardware or if it's some type of filter they felt they needed to apply, but either way, it is ugly. Here I was hoping that the Neo Mini would be hacked so that we could add our own games, and now my real hope is that it gets hacked so that if this is indeed a result of a software filter, someone smarter than me is able to give us the ability to use a third-party emulator to bypass this crap. This is perhaps the greatest disappointment of the unit, which is really saying something after just using the new control stick. The video output on the Neo Mini is complete bullshit. So I'll try to end this part on a more positive note. For what it's worth, when I did get to actually playing a few of these games, I felt like the emulation was fine. I've played quite a bit of these on original hardware, especially the Metal Slugs, and I didn't notice anything terribly glaring aside from having the edited versions of some of the games, but that doesn't really have anything to do with emulation. Yes, the controller took some getting used to, but I can't blame any of my mishaps on the actual emulation or lag. Everything seemed to play just as well as it does on my Pi device or Switch. No real complaints on this front, so my assessment here is that the emulation, at least, is not bullshit. Wow, so what a mixed bag this thing has ended up being. The feature that I thought would be the worst, playing on the actual device with that tiny screen and arcade stick, actually ended up being a really big positive and was nicely executed. And then on the flip side, the component that is arguably most critical, playing these games on your television like every other mini console, for some reason ended up becoming a black eye for this product. A large part of that is because of the experience rendered by using the controller, which I just never truly felt comfortable with due to the control stick. But then I also can't discount how much I judged looking at that subpar image of these games on a television. I just know that they can look so much better when they're emulated on a Pi or even the Switch. So given that the TV play experience is woefully subpar and it doesn't quite live up to being a true portable due to the lack of an included battery, it's with a heavy heart that I just can't recommend the Neo Mini. It's mostly bullshit. My beef with not getting a big red design was probably the least of the things I should have been concerned by, and unfortunately, SNK made that all too apparent with this product. Still, if you're really itching to play Neo Geo games and insist on giving your money to SNK and have zero other options in front of you, I guess you could give it a try, but I suspect you're just going to end up being disappointed and out $125. So that's it for today. Thanks for sticking with me through this quick review. And despite the self-indulgent bullshit theme, I hope that there were some legitimate and valuable points for you to consider. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Later, guys.